The Pope came out and talked about this. He says terrorism grows where there's no other option, and as long as the world economy has at its center the god of money and not the human, the person, he said this is fundamental terrorism against all humanity. He's speaking of raw, unrestrained, laissez-faire, unregulated capitalism, the kind that the libertarians like, the Tea Partiers like, that Paul Ryan likes. He said it is not right and it is not just. Speaking of terrorism, he says it's not right and not just to say that Islam is terroristic. If I speak of Islamic violence, I should speak of Catholic violence. Not all Muslims are violent. Not all Catholics are violent. In almost all religions, there's always a small group of fundamentalists, even in the Catholic Church, the Pope said. There is war for money. There is war for natural resources. There is war for the domination of peoples. Some might think I'm speaking of religious war. No, all religions want peace. It is other people who want war. And he's talking about the capitalists. In fact, the headline, Pope Francis, capitalism is terrorism against all of humanity. Meanwhile, piece in, yesterday's New York Times by Gina Kolata, titled Why Useless Surgery is Still Popular. If you want to bring a drug to market, you first have to prove that it's safe, and then secondly, you have to prove that it's effective. Thus the old phrase, safe and effective. And you have to prove that to the Food and Drug Administration, and they approve the drug, and then you can sell it. Not so with surgery. Surgeons do not, surgery techniques do not have to be approved by anybody. And so the New York Times looked at this thing. In fact, they said that the Food and Drug Administration does not regulate surgical procedures. So what happens when an operation is subjected to and fails the ultimate test, a clinical trial in which patients are randomly assigned to have that surgery or not have that surgery, and their outcomes are measured? And then they point out it's happened with two different kinds of surgery now: spinal fusion and surgery for a torn meniscus in the knee. Both of them have been tested in clinical trials. The conclusion: surgery was no better than alternative non-surgical treatments like supervised exercise and therapy. And this was back in the 2000s. This is with regard to the spinal fusion. Spinal fusion rates, even in the early 2000s, they came out with this proof the surgery doesn't actually work. The outcome of surgery is identical to the outcome of just, doing bending and stretching exercises. But spinal fusion rates continued to soar in the United States until 2012. What stopped them? What stopped all these surgeons from performing these operations for which they'd get $10,000, $20,000 a whack? Shortly after Blue Cross, North Carolina said it would no longer pay, and other insurers followed suit. Spinal fusion rates started to drop. Dr. Deo, one of the guys who did this research on this, he says that maybe the financial disincentives accomplish something that scientific evidence alone can't. The same thing with a torn meniscus. Most people with a torn meniscus get better from physical therapy. And in fact, they say patients tended to report, clinical trial comparing surgery with physical therapy in middle-aged people with a torn meniscus and knee pain. The result: surgery offered little to most who had it. And then came another study published July 20th in the British Medical Journal. It compared the operation to exercise in parents who have not had osteoarthritis but have knee pain and meniscus tears. Once again, the surgery offered no additional benefits. Why do doctors do it? Because it makes them money. This is why doctors should be on salaries. Now, I realize in the United States that might be considered a radical idea. When we lived in Germany in the 80s, we lived at a natural health center. Salem International. You can look at saleminternational.org. You can look it up in Steinach, Germany. And there was a doctor there. His name was Dr. Geert. He became a good friend of ours. He was on a salary, as was pretty much every doctor in Germany, as is pretty much every doctor in Europe. Now, it was a good salary. He was making the equivalent of around $125,000, $150,000 a year, which was, good money, big money, for Germany. And, of course, his education had been free, so he didn't have all kinds of college debt to pay off. The same thing in the UK, the same thing in most countries. And therefore, by and large, the docs in Europe don't do unnecessary surgery. We're all sitting around wondering, why is it that our healthcare costs are exploding? Well, could it have something to do with just the intrinsic nature of capitalism, which is, gobble, 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 eat as much as you can, take as much profit as you can, and then back away, right? Because you've sucked it all up. And then when you back away, it crashes. This is why we have these cycles in capitalism. This is why the stock market never goes more than 8 years without a crash or without at least a dip, shall we say. In fact, August 2nd, Deutsche Bank, this is from geopoliticalfutures.com. The headline, Troubling Signs Out of Germany and Saudi Arabia. And this is international capitalism. This is by Kamran Bukhari. He says, Germany's largest bank has expressed deep concerns about secular stagnation in the United States. In other words, we are, according to Deutsche Bank, we are about to go into a recession. Separately, Saudi Arabia's central bank has injected $4 billion into the kingdom's banking system in an effort to deal with liquidity issues. In other words, Saudi Arabia, suffering from low oil prices, 90% of their economy is based on exporting oil, is in deep trouble, and they're having to support their own currency. Kamran Bukhari notes, in early 2016, we highlighted the 10 nations that have been hit hard by decreasing global demand for exports and identified those next in line. Following China and Russia, Saudi Arabia was third on the list of countries that were already reeling from the slowdown. Germany topped the list of the 5 we identified as most vulnerable. The statements out of Berlin and Riyadh yesterday suggest the situation is going from bad to worse. Germany's largest bank, Deutsche Bank, is already in deep financial distress. A research note issued by Deutsche Bank, which warned the U.S. Federal Reserve that an interest rate hike in September would be a big policy error. Now, people are talking about, hey, the Fed is going to raise interest rates next month. The Fed is talking about, hey, we might raise interest rates next month. The Germans are scared to death of this. Why? Well, the United States is the largest destination for German exports, which account for almost half of that country's GDP. Germany is the largest economy in Europe, and the U.S. is its market of last resort. Saudi Arabia is the second largest economy in the Middle East and must continue bleeding money to maintain domestic stability and keep the chaos around it at bay. All of these are things that warn us about the economic system that we have and the corruption of our political system by that economic system, in my humble opinion.
To watch more clips from our programs, hit the Watch More Videos button over here. And please be sure to hit the handy-dandy subscribe button so you'll always be up to date. Tag, you're it.